Shabbat Shalom. We often hear from doctors, from clergy people, from many others in helping professions, at some point in their lives that they felt a calling to sacred service. And this idea of a calling looks and it feels a little different for everyone, but it is a phenomenon that is prevalent enough that we have language for it, that we understand when someone says, I had a calling. What do you call? Who called, right? I had a calling. I was 18 years old, standing in a death camp in Poland, when I felt my calling to become a rabbi. And I'm not sure that I can truly express that experience in any other words other than it was a calling. In that moment, I felt with absolute clarity what I was supposed to do with my life. And I am blessed to have a calling. Not everyone has a calling quite this directly, and even more blessed to now be living out my dream. But when we look to Torah, we see God takes many different dispositions, many different conceptions, and in the Garden of Eden that we read about just a couple of weeks ago, God is described as walking about the garden. And in the book of Shemot, we see a depiction of God as a burning bush. And later in the book of Shemot, we even physically see that God is revealing God's self, quite literally the back of God revealing to Moses. And all of these depictions serve diverse different ways in which God interacts with human beings. And Parshat Lech Lecha portrays God in a unique relationship with Avram, a unique relationship with humanity, in which he charges Avram with a calling. At the outset of the Torah portion this week, we find God speaking to Avram, and we've only met Avram just one chapter before in a genealogy. We don't know much about Avram at this moment. And seemingly out of nowhere, God comes to Avram and says, Lech lecha, go forth from your native land, from the house of your father, to the land that I will show you. We have no prior record of conversation between God and Avram. And out of the blue, God comes to this man and says, here I have this dramatic request for you. Leave everything that you've ever known and go out to a land that I will show you. And amazingly, Avram complies. It's no small feat that Avram leaves the land in pursuit of this lofty promise that God makes him. They don't know one another. They're not in relationship. We hear nothing of Avram's response to being called other than compliance, jumping right into action, taking his belongings and leaving. He does not argue. He does not even ask any questions. He gets to work transporting his wife, his nephew, all of their possessions, and hangs them on a hope that this calling, this direction from God is meaningful. And in a way, it would make perhaps more sense if Avram was moving on from a land in which he experienced a great deal of trouble, in which he had seen difficulty. And yes, there is some textual evidence that Avram has some trauma in the family, but at this moment, Avram seems to be doing quite well for himself when God says to him, Lech lecha. God hasn't even told Avram where he's going. He just says, go. Just go to any place that I'm going to show you, and Avram uproots himself entirely. So let's take just another moment. I know I feel like I'm really beating this point to the ground, but let's take a moment to really feel how radical this truly is. Imagine if you had a friend who came to you one day and said, I'm moving across the country, I'm moving across the world, because God has told me that I will prosper there. Even the most spiritually connected among us would think our friend might be losing it. we do not take kindly in our modern society to claims that God has given us instructions, that God is telling us what to do, at least in a literal sense. But when we expand this idea a little bit further, broaden the perception, we actually know all too well that feeling of being called, the feelings we experience when we perceive as though there is a future that depends on our willingness to comply with what I'm feeling at this moment. Perhaps this has something to do with the inherent connection that each of us has with our God. In the very first chapter of Genesis, we read, God said, "Let us make humanity in our image and after our own likeness." Last week, Rabbi Helfman noted, who is God talking to? Let us make humanity in our image, in our likeness. So that's a topic for another sermon. Who is God speaking to? One understanding here is that God is speaking to each of us, that there is a fundamental, ingrained piece of God in each one of us. And we see this written in our creation narrative, that God makes human beings, B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. And when we are truly listening, we can feel within ourselves the call of God, the call to righteous action, the call to need to conduct ourselves with integrity. And we know that sense of joy that comes from seeing the beauty of someone else's soul that is being reflected against our own. And we know the suffering that we feel when we witness the pain of another person. It is a voice inside of our mind that speaks to us, guiding us on a path to ethical behavior, to moral engagement. No, this is not God speaking to us prophetically, but it is most certainly a process of maintaining a relationship with that innate part of the human soul that is created in the divine image, that gives us a constant connection to our Creator. And through this lens, we have the chance to see Avram's calling in a very different way, a way that feels far more accessible, far more relatable than God coming to the door and saying something literally to us, giving us direct instruction. Have we not all experienced, in one way or another, some form of being called? God may not be speaking directly to us, as with Avram, but emotionally moving us, guiding us in ways that we don't always attribute to the divine. Sometimes this comes in the form of an inspiration, in the form of song, sometimes guiding our actions to create something. Sometimes this is an alarm bell, alerting us that there is something in our environment that is threatening our well-being, and it demands change. And sometimes it is that still small voice that whispers in our ear, life can be better than this. Lech lecha, go forth, find the right path. So at this point in the Torah reading cycle, we have read 11 chapters of Bereshit, and not one of them has overtly referenced a biblical character that the Jews would claim entirely as our own. Until now, Avram becomes the patriarch of the people of Israel, the first individual who carries the weight of covenant with God. And truth be told, Abraham, as he later becomes, is not perfect. He demonstrates major character flaws, just as all other human beings do up until this point in Torah, and as we still continue to have flaws. He is zealous. He has a strange set of priorities in certain occasions. He does not always seem to believe that honesty is the best policy. And in this way, we as modern readers should not learn that Abraham is perfect, that we should heed after every single one of his actions, meaning Perhaps we should not always jump forward at these callings. We do not always find that callings run so smoothly. Abraham's certainly did not. There are plenty of actions inspired by reactions, gut reactions, that need to be evaluated, that need to be processed and reflected upon in order to create a healthy life. So the takeaway of this address is not simply listen blindly to every gut reaction. Perhaps it's God telling you to do something. That's not quite it. But Avram's willingness to pursue God's promise is a spiritual calling. It's not necessarily an instruction, but something that we can learn from. There are times in our lives when we can see that something profound is about to happen. Sometimes it occurs to us right there in the moment, sometimes much later on upon reflection. And these moments can be the impetus for change, the change of a profession, the change of a physical location, change in a relationship, a new dream to reach for. Parshat Lech Lecha reminds us to be hyper-aware of these moments in which God tells us to do something, pointing us in some direction. Sometimes it comes in the form of words spoken amongst trusted loved ones. Sometimes it comes in the form of a question, so small, very unassuming, we don't even think about it in the moment, but there it sits in the back of our minds, insistent, and demands that we engage with it eventually and we move forward. Sometimes it comes in the form of our instincts, demanding that we heed the change that is required for us to be our most authentic selves. And I think that's ultimately where we're moving. The concept of listening to ourselves, listening to God, so that we can achieve our most authentic, our truest version of ourselves. Our inner voices of wisdom call us to all kinds of adventures, all kinds of choices. We are told, Lech Lecha, go forth to a land that we do not know, but to a land that promises beauty, of holiness, a relationship with God, and perhaps most importantly, a better understanding of our own selves. Shabbat Shalom.